Welcome to the American Rock Art Research Association's monthly lecture series. We're so glad you joined us, and we hope that you'll keep joining us on other times. If you, did I do something? No, okay. And that if this is your first time, if you will please check out our organization on our webpage, which is ARARA.org. And before we begin this evening's lecture, we want to let you know that the 2021 conference will be held as a virtual conference. It will be June 13th and 14th, and registration is now open on the webpage. The conference will include 30 presentations, 2 virtual field trips, our annual business meeting, and also our award presentations. So please plan on joining us. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's guest lecturer, Jannie Loubser. Jannie holds a PhD degree from the University of the sorry, I worked on this, and now I've got it wrong. Witwatersrand in South Africa, where his research focused on archaeological and ethnographic work on the early history of the Venda-speaking people in Southern Africa. He has also completed a course in rock art conservation and management in Australia, co-presented by the Getty Conservation Institute and the University of Canberra. After creating and heading the Department of Rock Art at the National Museum of South Africa in 1987, Loubser and his family immigrated to the United States in late 1993. As a contract archaeologist and rock art specialist based in Atlanta, Georgia, Loubser has worked on archaeology and rock art projects in states throughout the American mainland, including Baja California in Mexico and Alberta in Canada. He's also worked on projects in Bolivia, the Caribbean, and Hawaii. Most of Loubser's work involves rock art recording, graffiti mitigation, and writing management plans, but he also conducts excavations when necessary. I first met Jannie in the early 1900s. I got to know him in late 1990 when I contacted him about the contracting with the Santa Clara County Parks and Rec Department to do a train and to supervise volunteers in graffiti removal at Chautauqua Adams Interpretive County Park. This is the Native American site that was also the site of a school for 100 years. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Jannie Loubser, who will introduce us to the rock art of Georgia and the surrounding area. Thank you, Jannie, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Donna. Thanks for those kind words, and also thank you to you and Gary, for being so hospitable through the years when I visited California. Can you all see the screen?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, it's good. Also, thanks, Peter, for inviting me, the rest of the ARARA members. And basically tonight, the talk would be focusing on the rock art of Georgia, but I'm also going to look at the rock art from the neighboring states because, in the past, the states didn't always, boundaries don't always agree with what happened in the past. In some cases it does, in other cases not. So including neighboring states also increases the sample, so it makes, inferences a bit more confident. And I'm going to only look at the fixed petroglyphs or the fixed rock art, the pictographs and the petroglyphs. In other words, the paintings, the drawings, the engravings, the incisions, and the pec stuff. And I'm only going to look at the pre-contact stuff and not the stuff post-contact. So I'm not going to look at the historic stuff. And I'm going to use the word rock art, even though I know there are some groups out west, for instance, that do not like that term. They prefer the term rock writing. The talk will be divided in 2 parts. The first part was focused more, as I said, on the rock art of North Carolina, Western North Carolina, the mountainous bit, and then with the mountains coming back down into Georgia, I would be looking at that rock art too. And there's a lot of information collected by James Mooney and others on the Cherokee, because this is the last area where they lived before a lot of them were removed in 1838. Some of them remained and they still got living in the Western North Carolina. So some of those rock art places are still part of their tradition. The second part, I will be looking at some of the neighboring states' sites and you know, some of the stuff that spill over in Georgia, but also some of the unique stuff. And then I'll conclude by looking at the correct management, or as what we thought is thoughtful management and conservation practices. This presentation is a modification for a contract that I did via New South Associates for the Georgia Department of Transportation, where they needed some sort of a background context on Georgia rock art, and they realized, you know, the neighboring states will also be relevant. And so I kind of modified this talk a bit, so it's not such a big emphasis on compliance. So I'm starting off with the environmental context. The three main regions here that you can see is an orange, gray, and light gray. Starting in the west with the Region Valley, you could see the flat top mountains, and they capped by sandstone for the most part, and then limestone. There's a lot of caves here. This is where the dark zone caves occur. When I say dark, I hope you don't confuse me saying dog, a canine. What I'm saying is caves that do not receive sunlight from the entrance, that you've got to have some light to go in there. Then you get the much higher Blue Ridge Mountains that are not sedimentary, so you don't get the cave so much there. They tend to be higher, they tend to get colder in the winter. And this is the area where the Cherokees primarily lived. And then lastly, as far as the rock art is concerned, you get the Piedmont, the foothills, where you also get a rock outcrops like this one next to the creek. But it's sort of a mini version of the Blue Ridge, the Piedmont. All three regions have hardwood prime forest, you know, oaks, hickories, and so on. But, you know, succession growth by pine trees. In the past, as far as we know from charcoal record and also historical descriptions and photographs later on, there were far not that many trees. And as I would emphasize again and again, I guess, in this talk, is that the increased tree canopy is detrimental to the boulders today, because it delays evaporation and improves or facilitates biological growth. The people who lived in this area primarily historically, or, you know, in post-contact times that the Euro-Americans encounter, were sort of confederation of Muskogee Creek speaking people, and they mostly in the Piedmont region, and then the Iroquois Cherokee speaking people, mostly in the mountains, but also in the Piedmont. And these people shared a lot of customs and socio-economic practices, although even though their languages were quite different, you know, the Muskogee versus the Iroquois language, but the interaction was so much so that some early English travelers write that they'll go the 1 week to a settlement and find that it's got a Cherokee name, and then a bit later they'll go to the same settlement and find that it's got a Creek name. It just depends who was running the show at the time. But instead of being nation states or even nations or tribes, these people were divided among different town centers. And among the Cherokees, these towns were in different valleys. So I'm looking at these people because they are the descendants of the people who made a lot of the rock art that you're going to see tonight. Not the rock art in South Carolina, because the Catawba people stay there, so a bit different. But most of the stuff you'll see is either Muskogee Creek or Cherokee. And most of my emphasis, because I live in Georgia and I did contracts in the northern part of the state, would be Cherokee. Just to get to this diagram to explain why I consider it important to focus on the Cherokee is to look at the central ritual. I think if you look at people's central rituals, you can find out a lot about their customs, because that's sort of kind of like a fountainhead. Some religions have got more than one central religion, but a central practice among both the Cherokees and the Creeks, they shared a lot of things, was going to water ritual. And that was very important: fasting, sweating, and then purifying in water. And that helped you during life crises situations, like during birth, or like courting, going to war, before the ball game. You'll hear about the ball game later, and various things before you hunt. And one of the deities that focused prominently in the things in these rituals was Judakula, or Chulukulu, and also Corn Mother. And sometimes she also is known as Selu. And then Chulukulu beyond the sky dome was a guy called Kanati. Chulukulu was more, or Chulukulu was more, there's like the earthy manifestation of Kanati, if you like, to kind of simplify things. So in this diagram, you could see that the ritual is not independent of myth. A lot of things that are said in myth kind of has a feedback effect with what's happening in the ritual, and the ritual also gives rise to what is being said in the myth. So rituals are ongoing myths. What you find in the rock art is the visual expressions of those beliefs, and what you find in the myths are the verbal expressions of those beliefs. And as you'll see, that I gave you the environmental background, and the animals, species in all those areas is temperate woodlands. It'll be deer, white-tailed deer, it'll be panthers, you know, bears, a lot of fish in the rivers, waterfowl, a lot of birds. But you seldom get those animals depicted straightforward in the rock art. So it's not a menu, it's not a record of daily life. Some of the dark zone caves have got some stuff in it. So let me just give you an archaeological framework here, chronological frame. And Georgia, I didn't show it here because I think right now it goes a bit beyond the time limit than what we know the art. But it goes back to at least 10,000, if not more. And South Carolina, they found some stuff that could be older than 13,000. But as far as I'm going to give away some of the stuff right now, as far as the Georgia record goes down back to terminal middle archaic, about to 3,000 years or so BC, or 5,000 years before present. And the rock art goes right through to present times. So where do the petroglyphs and pictographs fit into this sequence? We know that they're old. People might ask that, how come that these things last so long? You paint on the wall, you apply pigment, wouldn't it come off, you scrape? I mean, a lot of graffiti disappears, over the years, not all of it, but, the shallow stuff. And it's because rock art is not on the rock, popular to conventional wisdom. Rock art is part of the rock. It's betwixt and between. It is both in and outside. And one reason for this, if you apply the pigment wet, the red ochre, for instance, it goes in between the pores in terms of sedimentary rocks, and then in terms of the metamorphic and the other rocks with a crystalline structure, you get that they'll go between the crystal interstices, the gaps between the crystals and the rock surface. So you get an anchoring of these things. But then in addition to that, through time, water running across the surface and water, the capillary reaction, having dissolved silica and other minerals in it, precipitates on the surface and form these surface layers that got silica, aluminum, and calcium oxalates and things like gypsum and so on, calcium sulfate. So that kind of seals it, and these things can last a long time if salts and stuff don't come along, or if people don't mess with it. And the same with petroglyphs. This is a cross-section photomonograph by Ron Dawn showing laminations in petroglyphs, where the dry periods is the red and the wet periods is the black. So if you look at it microscopically, it's almost like miniature archaeological layers. But the covering of these things and the weathering of these things make them difficult to see. And we were talking beforehand about how light plays an important role and that you cannot always see it. And it depends what angle the light comes from. Here you've got a boulder at a track rock gap in northern Georgia, where in the daytime, sometimes you cannot see things. So they should advise people when they visit early in the morning or late in the afternoon when there's raking light, or in spring or in fall, because that's when the sun is also lower. Here's some halogen lamps highlighting the rock, and you could see some of the detail here that you otherwise cannot see. And as you move the light, different details jump out. The same with the pictographs, the pigment. In full light, you can see some, this is because of the shade, you can see some red here, but you can walk straight by this. And when people do archaeological surveys, this is a danger. This is, become a very, very useful prospecting tool, and that is D-Stretch, a digital program developed by Mike Harmon and also by Bob Mark, who I saw is on the session tonight. And you can see that the details do pop out. And then usually I go a step further and I digitally trace these things at magnification. And then you can make thumbnails of these things that you can then play around on the digital desktop like you do with arrowheads or diagnostic sherds, and do classification and superposition overlap studies and so on. Now, just a word also, why rock art is so unique and different from other things, even old historical houses or structures, is that, well, it shares with houses and structures and stuff that they're anchored in the ground. Because I said I'm not looking at the portable stuff tonight, and I'm not looking at the art, mobile art. I'm looking at stuff that are reasonably fixed into the ground. So they become enduring places on the landscape, because for many, many millennia, they can be there and people can see there, then, if the light is right. And then also, other than archaeological work, instead, today we've got remote sensing that can rectify that, but we can record, if we do it properly, we can record rock art without damaging the rock art, and we can come back and back again and again and replicate and check what people have done before us. But at the same time, rock art is very susceptible because they are above ground surface, and that people can see them better, because of that, and changing management strategies and changing environments and stuff, one's got to think of long-term conservation practices, the compliance projects, for the National Register of Historic Places, section 106 and 110. They usually want people to identify and tabulate why rock art is important, why is significant. You can see here, significance assessment. That's what you do with 106 and 110. You might do a little bit of condition assessment. What is the thing, what is the integrity of the place? But very seldom there's a management assessment, as far as I know, and the management principles not often come to play, like minimal, repeatable, compatible, and distinguishable. And then the strategies, it's like somebody chasing down a car, getting the car. What do you do with the car? So once you've listed something eligible to the NRHP, how are you going to conserve it? Are you going to allow visitors? And how are you going to advertise it? And then finally, the recommendations here at the bottom, which you do make recommendations, but I do find that, in terms of sustainability and stuff, a lot of stuff fail because they're too ambitious, or, there is just not the follow-up, there's not the monitoring, they're not the reassessments. They think that, site is now, on the NRHP, there is, management things in place, signposts, boardwalks, etc., but yet things do occur. So I'll address that towards the end. So let's just return then to what the Cherokees and the Creeks at times said about it. As I said, most of the information about the petroglyphs come from the Cherokees, and they lived in the Blue Ridge and the Piedmont, the foothill regions here. And there was an overlap, as I say, with the Muskogee. Sometimes you found some Yuchi people living with them, some Shawnee, you even found Choctaw in that territory, Catawba. So these groups weren't as separate as the Euro-Americans tried to make them out. Perhaps like in South Africa, there was, or with the British, there was a bit of a divide and rule thing going on, I suspect. The earliest account that I know of that concerning the mention of petroglyphs in Georgia and North Carolina, here's the state line running, is of Charles Hicks. He was a prominent Cherokee somewhere in the late 1700s, telling John Haywood, who was a prominent statesman in Tennessee. I think he was in Tennessee even when it was still a colony. And he became, quite a prominent businessman, academic, and so on. Unfortunately, he believed in the lost tribes of Israel, so that kind of tainted a bit of his interpretations. But Charles Hicks told John Haywood about the track rock petroglyphs. Now, Mooney thinks that this track rock is in North Carolina. Yes, there is a track rock too in Northern Carolina, but this one refers to the Brasstown ones. The Brasstown is a town probably derived from an early Cherokee name in Western North Carolina. And then you get the Brasstown Creek, and then you at the bottom, you get Brasstown Bald, the highest mountain in Georgia. And the story went that the Cherokees, they were invited by Judakula, the master of game, and his wife to join them. And to do that, they had to go through a very rigorous fasting. And, you know, they weren't supposed to give the war whoop. What exactly that means, I'm not sure. And then they had to go to water. So the Cherokees they participated in the rituals, they just couldn't keep it. So they gave the war whoop. And then Judakula realized, you know, they're not going to be able to join. And as a substitute, according to tradition, mounds appeared and townhouses appeared. So then the Cherokees could go to townhouses to then be part of the Judakula sodality. Some people call it a cult. I don't like the word cult, but the Judakula sort of religious following. And then him and his wife, sometimes his wife is Kanati, sometimes she's a medicine woman. And what I forgot to say, this is a matrilineal society. It's matrilocal. These people are agriculturalists. They cultivate corn, domesticated corn, squash, and beans. And then they're also hunters. So hence, master of the game, and then the corn mother. Anyway, master of the game and the corn mother then departed up Brasstown Creek, going up to the headwaters, up to Track Rock Gap. And on their way up, they were said, Hicks told Haywood that they left their marks there, the whole family, because by that time they had the two little twin people too. And sometimes it's two boys, sometimes it's a boy and a girl, but both of them were kind of medicine people too. They had extraordinary powers. Along this trail, the last leg of the trail has been plotted by a surveyor in 1832. It's known as the Choe Story Trail. It's probably a Cherokee word, although a lot of words in that area, the rivers, are Creek words, that shows that the Creeks also lived in the area. And we found, lo and behold, subsequently, other petroglyphs in the area. The one called the Golf Course Rock, another one called the Soapstone Quarry Rock, and then Young Harris Rock. And then Track Rock, and then south there's the Halsey Rock. So along this trail, you get these petroglyphs, which is kind of significant or suggestive. Here's a photo of Brasstown Bald, where Judakula went. There are various of these mountain balls. They call them balls because vegetation, for some reason, sometimes do not grow at top. There's a debate whether people did that or, you know, whether it just happened. I know that now the Cherokee do not like it if the Forest Service burns there, because it upsets the little people and the spirit beings who reside there. And you don't mess with the little people because they act at a distance and they'll come at you and make life difficult. James Mooney's field sketchbook, he was an ethnographer that next mentioned the petroglyphs at Track Rock Gap. I don't think he was really that interested in material culture, but he quickly did this. This is a microfiche, is probably digitally also available now at the Smithsonian. And this is the recreation of his drawing simplification, but tidying up in his book, The Myths and Legends of the Cherokees. You can see already by 1832, people have removed stuff. There was a guy, geologist Stevenson, and he removed some stuff as curio to take home with him. And legend goes that he had not such a happy ending. This, you could see that there's Mooney sketches on the left. There's tracings I did in 2009 here on the right, and you could see again, there's a lot of detail, but I had the advantage of side lighting. I stayed there a week or longer, came back, checked stuff and so on. So that is an advantage. And that was my focus, to get things recorded. Now, they also told Mooney about the other track rock in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, in the Balsam Mountains. And this track rock is located between Canoga Town, where Judakula also resided, and in this instance, he resided with his medicine woman wife, and they resided in a little sweat lodge, an assi. And an assi is a miniature townhouse. So, you know, townhouse is also kind of like a sweat lodge where you do ritual and you contact the spirit beings and so on. So he didn't get along with his mother-in-law there. You get a lot of stories like that because these people are matrilocal. The men, they go and live with the wife's family, and when they tell the stories, the Mooney, some of the trauma of living with the in-laws, you know, kind of, I think, colored the stories a bit. But anyway, so they went up to Tennessee Bald, where it was the highest point in the Balsams. It's higher than Braston Bald, and that's where he had his house. Some people said it was in Judicula's courthouse, but anyway, he lived up there at the head of the creek of the Pigeon River. And on his way, they said that they rested. The wife sat down on the rock, and she menstruated. And in the spirit world, when people menstruate, they give life to children. It's just the reverse. The spirit world is reverse. When it doesn't rain here, you go to the spirit world to ask for rain, because that's where it rains. If there's no game here or the crops fail, you go up to these high places to ask for game and crop, you know, success. But anyway, so Judicula went up there and they left their marks at the rock, which marked the way onto their abode. Like in the Braston Valley, here, the Pigeon River Valley, you get that people did that. But then due east, look, mention, note that this is north-south, the Canoga Town, Tennessee Bald thing. But then there's an east-west thing through too, where Judicula Rock is west of Tennessee Bald. And here is Judicula's townhouse near the Bald where he lived. And supposedly, I guess he still lives there, you know. And so that his name was Chulikulu or Tulikula, Juthkula, or known among Euro-Americans as Judicula. And that basically means in Cherokee, the slant-eyed giant. He was also known as the Red Man, a family member of the Thunderers, of the extended matrilocal family of the Thunderers. And his eyes were slanted, referring to his pupils. And his pupils were those of mountain lion, and also those of you know, snakes that can see in the night, because we were talking earlier, this guy can see in the dark, like certain trees can too, cedar trees, for instance. Now once there's a story that's oft repeated where hunters came, they wanted to go up to Judicula's townhouse, up at Tennessee Bald, and they didn't do the necessary going to water and fasting and stuff. And Judicula, they must have had a bad trip or something. I don't know. It could be metaphorical, but Judicula jumped down from his mountain abode, landed on the rock with his long nail. He had sort of claws like that of a cat. He scraped this line, and he said, if you dare come across this line and not do the necessary ritual, you know, you'll have the consequences. And then also he broke his fall coming down with his hand, and you could see this hand here has got 7 digits, and they kind of claw-like. And you could see it here on the drone photo to the left that was done by Joe Logan. I know that Bob Mark also did some photographs there. And then you could see Judicula elsewhere. You find him, for instance, on a rock in further west at the confluence between the Iwasi River and the Braston Creek. You see the 6-digited hand here. Everywhere where you get a figure with more than 5 digits, that is Judicula. They call that the maker's mark, his signature. And here he's with a winged, beaked figure, a hollow-bodied figure that's very unusual. And you get these type of things on Mississippian artifacts that have known dates. So this could be a thunderer. And then the snakes and all the beings from the underworld on this. This is an island in the middle of the river. And what I wanted to say also, Judicula Rock, by the way, is at a spring head. So these rocks, note that they always close to river, even though you cannot see always water close by. when I said river, I mean a water source. It could be a creek, it could be an underground source that we just can't see today until a tree falls over, or there's earth moving activities like an artery, or it's next to a water body that, you know, there is flowing water. So motifs that are associated with Judicula and his family of spirit beings, not always in the traditions shared with Mooney, but if you look at the ethnography, they come apparent. Cherokees afterwards, after Mooney, went up with people like Stevenson and various other people, and also some Creeks, and they said the giant spirit, which is Mooney, which is the Judicula, the mastiff game, him and his family and animals, they left some of these footprints that you see, they all point upwards, and you see in another rock too, a track rock. That's why they call it track rock gap. So along the way, you get this young Harris rock along the Cherokee Trail, and you also get a faint thing there that resembles a foot. So that ties in with that tradition. The journey up to Braston Bald from the floodplain settlements. Then you get the tracks of animals that emerge from below the ground, and you see they go in various directions. Some of them look like turkey tracks, others look like deer tracks, and then yet others look like rodent tracks. And then some resemble vulvas, but it's sort of like a double entendre that the vulvas are also deer tracks, the vulva forms. So the deer tracks, some of the Cherokees say that they come from, you know, where there was a lot of animals escaped from the underground and they left the marks. But there's an interesting tradition in the footnotes collected by Mooney, and he's got these old photographs in the 1890s that he didn't publish in his books, but, you know, that people got hold of. I think it was Scott Ashcraft and Laurie Hansen, where you see Judicula, the Gardner Rock in the northern part of western North Carolina, with all these deer tracks and bear tracks and things on it. Here's a drone photograph that I kind of enhanced of the rock. The top portion is gone now. But here at Kanati, which is the sort of transcendent above the sky zone version of Judicula, his two sons, they opened the rock and out came all the deer. And so, of course, you know, the Cherokees were happy because, you know, the deer came from underground and they could, you know, hunt these things. But they left the imprints all over the rock here. Sometimes you get a directionality to the imprints. Other times it's as if the animals were kind of disorientated. So they tracks in all directions here of the deer and of the bears and things. So vulva forms is another thing that you get on the rocks, more so in Georgia than in other areas. You get in bit in Alabama, maybe one or two in North Carolina. And this is, as I said, where the medicine woman sat down, menstruated, and gave life to babies. You get them in various rocks. They're kind of football-shaped things. Then you get these concentric rings that they can be various things, but they have basically the same meaning. They're sort of corresponding or relational symbols or whatever you'd like to call them. They've got the same sort of references that they refer to. You get, some people call them whirlpools, other call them townhouses. And a townhouse sometimes can be a whirlpool. It can change into a townhouse, or you know, townhouse can revert back to a whirlpool. It can be the snake that's curled around. These townhouses sometimes are curled around the fireplace, or any other portal to the spirit world, because these are the places where people, you go to the townhouse for rituals and you commune then with the spirit beings. Also, whirlpool can suck you up and you can go to the world of spirit beings. And snakes, they transfer, human transfer into snakes when they go into water, for instance. So all these things are interconnected. And you could see here, for instance, in Iwasi Brasstown on a river, a rock that's in the middle of the river, it's got this the spiral. And then this other rock that some people refer to as the horned serpent, which is also a family of Judicula over there. Then you get these cross and circles, which are, you know, the four cardinal directions, but also where Selou, the corn mother, where she was killed by the twin sons, and the blood then, you know, went down the furrows that was drawn in the ground by the sons in a cross and circle thing. And that's where corn came from, sort of a self-sacrifice thing, where, you know, corn emerged from the ground. And what all these things have in common is sort of, they spots of, you know, entryway, or spots where the spirit world is the source of life-giving things, you know, of fecundity, of fertility. Then there are these meanders, and there's not a really a clear interpretation for them. People that I've shown it to, they say it's trials, maps, and Cherokee traditions also get that reference. And these people are known to have maps, and you know, so it could possibly be true that they indeed are maps. So let's look how these symbols then, you know, relate chronologically. And I've done this by looking at superpositioning. So there are two rules when you look at superpositioning. You know, if a spiral, or say if a cross and circle is on top of a spiral in one case, and then a spiral is on top of a cross and circle in another case, or sorry, a spiral, a cross and circle, sorry, let me say that again. Let me just go to the numbers. If a 1 is over 2 in one instance, but you find in another instance that 2 is on top of 3, then even though you didn't find where 1 is on top of 3, you've got to assume then that 1 is on top of 3. And that's called the transitive rule. And, you know, considering that your sample is big enough and you haven't found any exceptions to the rule, you've got to then go along with that chronology until, you know, as I said, there is something else found. The antisymmetric rule sort of points to relative contemporaneity, where 1 is on top of 2 in one situation, next observation found 2 on top of 1, and then they're relative contemporary. Again, one can then look, you know, in which cases are 1 over 2, is it more times than 2 is over 1? So you can sort of derive a relative chronology that way. You could fix it to the absolute, or whatever, the physical chronology derived from mainly radiocarbon dates, by looking at the horizon markers. Out up west in Oregon, those places you get the Mount Mazama ash. That is a horizon marker. And when things are below the Mount Mazama ash 7,000 years ago, they're older than Mount Mazama ash. If they're sort of within the ash, then they're 7,000 years old, and when they're above, they're younger. By how much, you do not know, but at least you've got some sort of a marker there, a level, if you like, a datum line where you can then slot things into. Now, the first one over here are the soapstone extraction marks on soapstone rocks. Not all petroglyph boulders of soapstone, but some of them are. So they have these quarry scars, most of them. And you see here where they chip, 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 you can still see the chip marks to get these blanks out. And then from these blanks, they carved out these boulders. This one is still in process. Ultimately, the boulders will come out quite nicely. So they use these to cook directly on fire. Before that, they cooked in pits. What happens when you cook on fire? Soot sticks to the sides, and you can date that soot. And that soot is fairly accurate, because the date of the carbon, unless you've got an old wood issue, the date of a carbon is close to that of when the object was used. And we find quite a tight chronology in the Southeast, that between about 3,800 years and 3,000 years before present, which is the soapstone horizon. And that is the terminal late archaic. It came a bit after ceramics, kind of counterintuitive, but that is the case. Then the next horizon marker that they have dates for are these cross and circles and concentric circles that you find in pottery that's associated with charcoal in sort of enclosed context, where, you know, they date anything from 1,700 to about 500 years BP, which coincides with the middle woodland Mississippian. So anything with crosses and circles or concentric rings will fall in that time period. Similarly, down here, anything that's truncated by the soapstone extraction scars must be older than the scars. By how much, we don't know, but anything that's within these bold scars must be younger. By how much, again, we don't know, unless there is these concentric rings or so. And then finally you get metal tools. They could not have come earlier than when De Soto came in 1540. So that, implements, the tools used will give you a date. Now, looking at individual rocks, I always thought that, all the petroglyphs are post the soapstone extraction, so younger than the late archaic. But here at Young Harris, that was found not so long ago, I found these soapstone extraction scars, bowls and stuff like that, because sometimes they take the whole thing out, so it becomes like a hollow. And you find that these cupules are in there, and they were truncated. So they must be older. They were done sometime before the soapstone was taken out. Here are the soapstone extraction scars, and then you find cupules within the scars, so they must be later, and then you find that vulva shape there also in the scar. So at least some of the cupules predate the soapstone. Then I also found just recently, going over for the G dot for that report, the background report, that this is abbreviated version of, believe it or not. But I find that these meanders, there's some very faint meanders, and they truncated by the soapstone. And then there's some figures that look like figures on top of the soapstone, and then they are underneath these concentric rings. And as I said, they date to the Woodland and Mississippian period. And then you get some cupules on top of that, which, sometime later. The thing at Judicula Rock, again, the fainter meanders, some of them were reworked. They tend to be at the bottom of the sequence. But they don't overlap the soapstone extraction things here. You get depressions up there and the blanks down here. Then there's some cupules on top of the meanders and the extraction. And then on top of the cupules, some figures. And then on top of the meandering figures, you get these imprints. There's a foot there, and then there's Judicula's hands over there. And you get the concentric rings here, and a cross and circle there. And some of these designs, particularly the figures, are incorporated. And this is why it was difficult in the beginning to see the difference. But if you go back and you look at the evidence again, they were incorporated into the earlier meanders. So people came later on, and they recognized the earlier stuff, and they added to it. And then finally, the cupules again on top of all the other things that are there. So the cupules seem to be always sort of sealing, being the last stuff added, the earliest, but also the last. So they go throughout the sequence. At Track Rock Gap, where there were sequences that I found at least 4 different rocks. I'm just going to show you the main boulder here, boulder 6, because it's got the most elaborate stuff, and it's not contradicted by the other boulders. You find, again, the meanders here at the bottom. They don't really make sense, partly because they're so faint, but also because they're obliterated by later stuff. Then you get the vulva forms on top of them. Then you get the figures, some of them upside down, again, merge and the reworking of the earlier incisions. Then you get the footprints on top of the figures and top of the vulvas. And you get the bird tracks there. And then you get the cupules, and then the cross and circles up there, the latest stuff, very few. Reinhardt Rock, which is the Northern Georgia foothills, which is now on display in a museum. The others that I've shown you are all still outdoors. Clearly, there's meandering stuff at the bottom. As far back as the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, Margaret Perryman was a pioneer in research in that area. She noticed it too, that, these weird meandering stuff at the bottom. Then she noticed also these feet up there. And on top of the feet, these concentric rings that have been interpreted by the Cherokees, as I said, as townhouses or settlements. And then right here at the end, the cross and circles. Sometimes they are on top of the concentric rings, and then the cupules. So not a contradiction here. So there's some other places too that I'm not going to go because, time is marching on. And So overall, the sequence goes, back almost, 4,000 years and to almost the present, because Turkey track rock that I showed you, the one photograph of, is done, Turkey tracks done with metal tools. So that tradition seemed to have, even though it's part of the earlier tradition, seemed to have continued. Sandwiched between the sort of woodland Mississippian horizon and the late Archaic horizon is an early woodland thing that's got all it's got some of the meandering things, although some of them might be, late Archaic. It's got the vulva shapes, it's got the footprints, and also the figures, although some of them might also be later. So that is the relative sequence here. So almost 4,000 years of adding stuff to rocks. Does it mean a shift in meaning? And as you saw, that all the motifs or the designs have symbols that refer to fertility, fecundity, a linkage to the spirit world. So maybe through time, people express different ways to the linkage to that world. As I said, the incorporation of previously picked and engraved motifs suggests that, people well, not only suggest, I think it goes to prove in a sense that, later people acknowledge what went on previously. And the spiritual role of water helps explain the enduring nature of the petroglyphs, both in terms of the physical nature of water and the spiritual nature of water. Physically, and I know this from graffiti removal, is that once you created some rock dust by initial pecking, you speed up the process. You can make sometimes quite deep engravings and peckings by, adding water, and the water creates an abrasive slurry. The water is highly polar, so the little particles stick together. They create an increase in surface to cut. And I think even in modern industry, sometimes you get blades and stuff that they irrigate, and then it's got grit on it to cut through stuff. So then also there's, I mentioned the going to water ceremony. There's a lot of stories of people changing into snakes as they go into water. So it's a realm of between this realm and the other realm. And the opposite realm, the spiritual realm, the realm where people get life-giving forces from, kind of counterintuitively, but that is the logic behind this. And so petroglyphs in northern Georgia, and I'll show you some other examples, and in western North Carolina, tend to be located near water. This at Bowling Park here on the left is in a little creek at a neat point. This at Shoal Creek, next to a little waterfall. There's some designs. This in the middle of the river, the Iwasi River, these designs. So in the words of David Lewis Williams, who is a better wordsmith than I am, say the enduring petroglyphs become, being around and being added to through all these years, the repository for the accumulated insights of generations. I think it kind of summarizes that. So just to get to the landscape settings of these petroglyphs, as I showed beforehand, that these petroglyphs are along old, river corridors, and there are big settlements in these floodplain because they practice agriculture, so they needed alluvial soil to plant their corn and their squash and their beans. And the petroglyphs kind of occur between these big centers and these mountain centers, big towns, and where the spirits live up here in the mountains. And being a long man, almost like a non-human being entity, a river's feet are said to be in the floodplains and its head in the mountains. So all that sort of consciousness that he gets in the mountains, he takes down. And the river speaks in murmurs that, the medicine people can understand. During transitional periods, I already mentioned, they go to rivers, during life crises and stuff, for birth, curing, war, ball game, and so on. And then fasting, as I said, prerequisites, and going to the water. And, as the Cherokees explicitly state, rivers coming down from the mountains. And they are the trials, or the pathways by which Cherokees could reach the spirit houses. And the creeks are the heads, at the heads are doorways. So the creeks starting there at Track Rock Gap, starting underneath Judicula Rock. These are all entry points. Kuluwi town, which is down here, I don't know whether you can see, but that where my cursor's pointing, that was a place of Judicula. It is a shortening version. It's the place of Judicula we. We is the locative, so it's just the place of Judicula. Kula is the last, the suffix of Judicula. And so they went up there to Judicula Rock, where was a settlement next to the Caney Creek, and that was called the Eastern Gate. They also refer to Judicula Rock, I've heard, as the turtle, the gatekeeper, that then you had to go and report to before you went up to Tennessee Bald to supplicate for game. Now, Brinkley Rock is another petroglyph rock that's been removed, but it used to be somewhere in between Judicula Rock and there. And the same with Track Rock between Canoga Town. And again, you know, these the cardinal directions are kind of interesting. It's interesting too that Judicula's fingers, he had 7 fingers. It's the 7 cardinal directions, which is up, down, east, west, and north, south. And then also, you know, the state of mind, that's a person, that's the 7th. So, you know, it plays out on a landscape scale too. And the petroglyphs are part of that. Here's a turtle-shaped rock on the way between Sequoia Town and Northeast Georgia. That it's near Clarksville now. And there's a story of a Cherokee following 2 women with long black hair, and he wanted to court them. He saw them, the apparitions appeared while he was doing this fasting and dancing and, you know, going to water inside the townhouse at Sequoia Town, which was quite a prominent Cherokee town. So he followed them in the night up this river, Deep Creek, it's known today, up these hill ridges, past the rock. They don't mention the rock in the tradition, this particular rock, but today you can still see vestiges of an old road that go by there. And then he went behind the falls at Tallulah Falls, then to go into, you've got to go down into the underworld to reach the upper world. And so he went down to visit the Thunderers. And as he went through the vale, through the waterfall, the 2 girls turned into 2 ugly old men with no hair. They were bald. So that's the reverse. And the quiet night turned into hell. There was thunder, lightning. The horned serpent appeared. He sat on a rock at the entrance. Note the entrance, and it turned into a turtle. And this turtle wasn't too friendly. And the guy ran away, and he went back, and he made the mistake of telling people. Like, there's a Cherokee belief, if you tell people about your meeting with the spirit world, you're going to join the spirit world. You'll depart the physical world, in other words, in terms of, you know, current perceptions, you die physically, but then you go to the spirit world, so you become separated. The other petroglyphs do more in the creek area. That's along the old Tugaloo Trail, or that connected Etowah Mounds with Swanny Mountain and Coal Mountain. There is the Bowling Park Rock that you saw. There's Rhine Up Rock that you saw. Then River Hill Rock. I think I might have some pictures of that. And then Silver City Rock. All these big petroglyph boulders along this other river corridor, which in this case, you know, is the Etowah River. Then you get a river corridor going down the Iwasi River. You get the Iwasi Rock, you get Iwasi Rock 5, you get the Iwasi Bridge Rock, the Iwasi Brass and Confluence Rock, the one that I'll show you some photos, and also the Iwasi Brass and Confluence Island Rock, where you saw these Mississippian things. And that place, that confluence with the Brasstown Creek, is known as the Southern Gate, or the place that's got strong medicine. There's also the place that had strong medicine for war, people before they're going to war. And as I said, this Brasstown Creek here eventually joins up with Brasstown Bald. Scott Ashcraft and Laurie Anson, and they've got very good eyes to spot stuff. I mean, some of the things they see, even in the best conditions, is difficult to see, but they are there. They scouted this, they surveyed this Iwasi River between the strong place and the Peach Creek Mound, which were occupied throughout the Mississippian and part of the woodland, and they found nothing. So these petroglyphs seem to link up with a corridor going up to Brasstown Bald. Anyway, that is the hypothesis at this stage, unless some counter evidence is found. Now, to get to the spatial distribution, The track rock style, that was what I was talking all about. You know, it's named after track rock because there are 8 rocks and they've got all the stuff that, you know, is in this petroglyph style that extended to North Carolina. Cherokee Rock is, you know, associated with that. It's got the most ethnographic record, and also the most, the best, you know, the most thoroughly recorded at this stage. I guess because the sample is not very big, you know. And anyway, these are the figures, some of the variations of the figures that you find within that tradition. And this is the distribution. You get in the other areas to the west, you get the trap tradition. Then in South Carolina, you get the Haygood milk tradition. And then up in the mountains, there's the Long Ridge Road tradition. So I don't know if you guys are tired, you know, this is the end of the first session. We're going to go into the second half now. And if you've got, you know, interest in seeing stuff from dark zone caves and some of the neighboring states, rock art, and also some rock art from northwestern Georgia that we not found not so far ago. I'm going to go into those. Oh, before I do that, let me just see something about the cup hills. Their distribution is very much like that of the track rock tradition. It is, you know, focused in the Blue Ridge Mountains and then the upper Piedmont foothills of Georgia, and also, you know, North Carolina in the Blue Ridge there. It's your standard petroglyph boulder, no rock art, just petroglyphs. You all saw that there were petroglyphs on the cup hills on the petroglyph boulders that I showed before. Yeah, you get no petroglyphs, but yet the distribution agrees very much like that of the boulders. And Alan Kressler, who studied these things, and who also has walked more of Georgia of any other person I know, he found that south of that area there that I'm marking, there are plenty of very good rocks and stuff, but you find no signs of cup hills there. So you might get the odd cup hill in Alabama, few in Tennessee. So could this be cup hill concentration that Laurie Johansson and them also found up in North Carolina? Could it relate somehow to the Cherokee? We know that some Cherokee at some stage lived in South Carolina too. So you get them in riverine settings, you get them, you know, on hill slope settings, or even places where they're quite high up. And some of them are fancy, like this one that has been enhanced. You see another one there, and then you see some ordinary cup hills here. There's a cup hill corridor there at the Hiawassee too, where you get cup hill rocks, but only cup hills, no petroglyphs. And it's the same corridor. So there's something going on there. Okay, Long Ridge Road style. It's not in Georgia, but I want to just mention it because it's got these faint weathered circles, some of them similar to the things that you get at the bottom of the Seekers in Georgia, some of the stuff in North Carolina. And then it's got this meanders. But it's a regional tradition here on tightly circumscribed and the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. And it is above 2,000 feet that you get these things. They're on nice exposed bedrock pavements on sloping ground. And here you see some of them. Now there's big controversy going on. You know, some geologists say that these things can be natural instead of cultural. Well, all I could say is there are some vulva shapes, and then also some cup hills that I cannot see that it's natural. And Nicole Savini now I think in May, she's coming out, and she's going to take some thin sections, and she's going to check, you know, for microscopic traces of, you know, whether it is cultural or natural or perhaps both. So here is a drone photo that I kind of put my tracings of the stuff on top, that you could see they're concentrated in specific area. There's other areas that you don't find. They're usually on sloping ground. And they all seem to be around this big rock, which is Table Rock, is one of the higher points in the area. I think it's the highest, one of the highest mountains, the second highest peak, or top, mountain top in South Carolina. And the other side I'm talking about, the Long Ridge Road, is down there somewhere in the slope. So, you know, to get up there, you had to go up these slopes and walk and get to you. At the highest points, like elsewhere in Georgia and North Carolina, they don't have the stuff. It's just on the edges. And sometimes it's quite dangerous. So were these destinations too, you know, to people way back? You know, perhaps, you know, it's no way of telling, but, you know, if we get more information from these things. Then there's a tradition just south of that in the northern Piedmont of South Carolina that I've got these rectangular things with circles, little figures and so on, which I just call the Haywood Mill rectilinear style because they're kind of in that area of Pickens County, and they're quite unique, nothing like that in Georgia. And they tend to occur at neat points where there's waterfalls and rapids and stuff like that. And this is where they occur, sort of going down into the central Piedmont of South Carolina. I don't think they're going to Georgia, and that is really the impression also of Alan Kressler, because he's walked those mountain peaks up here in northeastern Georgia. And so it's a very regional style, and that maybe it's associated with, you know, different linguistic groups like the Catawba, and you know, if these groups indeed have, or these linguistic groups at least have that old tradition. Then another one is the trap site style. This is a site named after the type site that I just gave the name, you know, after talking to Alan and people, that it's a very elaborate site on the left. It's got a whole slew of designs, very many of them, you know, agreeing or overlapping or similar or reminiscent to the stuff you find in Georgia and North Carolina. You find its concentric rings. You find also a footprint or two, but far less. You hardly find any figures, which is interesting. And then when you do get crosses, you get these crosses that you just don't, I've never seen in Georgia, North Carolina. Then you get these meanders they're a bit different there, that look that they could be older. Again, one's got to go and confirm it. I don't think folks here have really looked at the superpositioning yet. Then you get, instead of being on boulders, and perhaps because this is the sandstone area with a lot of shelters, you tend to get the football vulva shapes and so on more within shelters. This is Witch's Nest in northwestern Georgia, and this is the this is a site, the Bradley site, and also in northwest Georgia, in the sandstone and the limestone there. I think both of these are sandstone, and you get designs that are sort of that you find in Tennessee and northern Alabama too. So it's rather than being part of the central Georgia, North Carolina style, it's separate, and you can see here, but it goes parallel to it. So maybe here is a different group. You can see a bit of a gap there. I don't know, more research might close the gap. You see the two sites there in northwestern Georgia. There's some other sites too that's just not been, you know, that I haven't seen and so on, so I'm not going to comment on that. Then you get the above ground pictograph sites. You get the paint rock style. It's a site that I worked at. It's mentioned back in 1799. Well, back then, a surveyor found it. And even back then, there were already graffiti on this rock, you could see here. And during the Civil War, apparently Union troops added to the graffiti. Students at parties here, they burned some ties there. But escaping all of that, up on that ledge about 8 meters above ground, you find this verniculated design, sort of a meandering design, looking like the verniculations that you'll find in the brook trout. It's a fairly stable rock. You see some flakes there, but they kind of semi-attached and quite well attached to the rock. And so the Forest Service got me out to do that, and I took 3 samples. One sample was from yellow pigment, the other sample was from red pigment, and then the third sample was also of red pigment, but that sample then was also dated. Now, the energy dispersal for EDS spectra of the red pigment shows there's some iron in there, you can see there and there. Of the yellow, it showed very little or no iron, but it showed sulfur, peach and sulfur. So the makeup, the recipe or the signature of these 2 colors are quite different. You get sulfur hot springs about 5 miles or so south of there. So maybe perhaps with yellow pigment, maybe perhaps they brought the pigment from there. If you record it closely, you see that the pigment, the yellow pigment, there are little splashes on top of the red. And so the yellow was applied just after the red. So it shows you that way back they did this. The radiocarbon date came back quite surprising. Now, whether one wants to believe this date or not is another matter, but there was a lot of carbon in here. You can see it's an old date, but it's got only a counting area of 40 plus or minus, which, you know, minimize the counting rate, the error. And the problem here was that it's an aggregate date of all the carbon, and most of the carbon, according to the EDS spectra, came from below, just below the red pigment. So, you know, if anything, it gives a maximum date that the pigment is not older than that. But anyway, if you take it at face value, it's the second oldest dated rock art in the Southeast or east of the Mississippi that I know of. I mean, there might be others. The per mil ratio between the stable isotopes, the carbon-13 and carbon-12, is -18. And that apparently falls within the range of ungulates, things like bison, blood, and also xeric plants, they're juices. So we're not sure, maybe one can do some DNA. But I have to say that when we did take that samples, the Forest Service made very sure that they had Native American, the tribal representatives, permission to do it. So that was the paint rock style that you get in central Georgia, then the central North Carolina. Then you get this, the Swani style, which are this rock art that you find just north of the border on the Tennessee side of things. This is typical on the left here. Cameron Waters traced it in, recorded in the 1950s. Now it's covered by soot. But a guy called Rich Otter and then later Alan Kressler, they did this de-stretch photograph. You can see some graffiti here of this fish, which could be that giant fish again. And these shelters contain woodland period lithics and ceramics. All of them face south. It could be just a function of the sunlight. Sunlight, by the way, is good for rock art preservation. Bake these things in. This is a site I went with Alan and recorded it. And it's sort of a typical Swani style pictograph. And these things are named after the community of Swanny and Franklin County in Tennessee, South Tennessee, because most of the Swanny sites have been found there. There are more and more of them now being found. And you can see the and Franklin County 26, and the style goes up to into the northern part of Tennessee, where it borders North Carolina. But some of this might have ended up in the open air Mississippian stuff. So you could see, for instance, this winged person here, and then another wing being there. And I worked at the site, we removed graffiti, and I recorded all of this. And Alan Kressler also took some excellent photos from which I could do my recordings. And it calibrates to some cane charcoal calibrated between 1300 and 1430. So a later date. So it could be a mix, some of these things that you get in the open air shelters. So now we're going to go to the dark zone caves in more or less the same area as what you get the Swani Style. The dark zone caves, they're not really apparent. The entrance is always from the surface. Here's a cave in northwest Georgia that Alan Kressler, that he's been to more than about 5,000 caves in the world. That includes Sulawesi and all over the place. And unlike the above ground stuff, they finely incised or finger drawn, finger drab mud glyphs, sometimes with a stick. And the pictographs, instead of being red and thick, they are black and thin. They're drawn, they're not painted, so they were applied dry. And as I said, the Cherokees is not a fun place if you're a traditional Cherokee to enter, because there are a lot of stuff going on. The oldest, I'll show you the second oldest, but the oldest date that one dates to 3,790 to 3,700. The terminal middle archaic, which is the same sort of type period as the one from Paint Rock above ground. Charcoal drawings. These dates I trust because they charcoal. You might get the old wood problem, but you know, there are other artifacts and stuff there to, you know, confirm in the independently confirmed late archaic stuff or middle archaic stuff. Then you get at the third unnamed cave, you get calibrated range that's all a terminal late archaic, but later. Then you get this stuff in the mudglyphs. You sometimes get mud instead of calcite, you get mud building up against the walls. And this figure, the 19th unnamed cave in Northeastern Alabama, massive, massive figures. I mean, I think these are taller than life. You can see the eared thing here. Some think it's a bear. This being against the ceiling, and that calibrates the terminal middle woodland. The dates that were found on the ground associated with these caves. Some of them are really deep in. Then you get incisions and scrapings. And this is from middle to late Mississippian in the 11th unnamed cave in Tennessee. What is interesting here is you get a mace here, and it's got a human face. And then this, you get a merger of a being with a bird, with a raptor, and he's holding a mace there. Then you get an axe here that also got an eye, and it's got a mouth and a profile. And it's interesting, just like rivers can have personalities, quartz crystals can have personalities, artifacts also had personalities. They were other than human beings, entities in a sense. Then in the Mudglyph cave a bit later, the dates range all over the show. Charles Faulkner was the first person to find, to study this cave. Then he was followed by Jan Simic, and the work of Jan really revolutionized our understanding of these caves and the chronology. So kudos to Jan, for doing all that groundbreaking work. And some people think this is a stickball figure that I'll show you some picture, but later, a photo of stickball players that also went into caves much later, not now, I don't know, but at least in 1828, to do stuff there, to commute with the ancestor, or to commune with the ancestor spirit. Dark Zone Cave art is very much the distribution of that of the Swanny stuff, if you recall earlier on. And Jan Simic has got some very interesting hypotheses about the entire landscape being a cosmogram, and it's got a bit of a different logic to it than the stuff of the Cherokees, which goes to show that the Mississippi period, even though there was a lot of commonalities, there were differences too. So the Mississippian ceremonial complex, as people call it, was really also a quilt work or mosaic of a lot of somethings. And this really comes out in the rock art. And the rock art, the different styles, I think, add nuance also to the ceramic styles and the lithic styles. It shows that they're probably a more fine-tuned indicator of ethnic and linguistic differences. So here's the synthesis of the chronology. What I want to bring out here is that the very oldest pigment, the charcoal drawing of the little figure and the animal, 48th cave at the bottom. Immediately, the oldest known one is iconographic. People sometimes think, oh, the oldest must be abstract, people struggle. No, from the word go, like we found in Sulawesi now in Indonesia, the oldest stuff is very representation. You can see what's going on. And then maybe the second oldest, the thing I had dated, I'm still a bit skeptical. But anyway, Jan seemed to accept this date, a direct date of the carbon within all the layers associated with the pigment, this outside painting, a paint bluff. And this is the only outside painted one. And then there seemed to be a bit of gap that might be filled in at some stage. Then you get abstract and iconographic stuff here, get stuff from Kentucky. Then the middle woodland stuff, those giant things from the caves, from the Mudglyph there, 19th unnamed cave in northeastern Alabama. And then in Wisconsin, you get some direct dates of an elk there, showing the stuff went on. But then you get explosion in the Mississippian, just all this stuff. And here where cattle deers, granadas have been working, a bit more elaborate stuff, but different. Again, shows you that it's the Mississippian, the same as the stuff in Tennessee, but yet it's stylistically, it's got some different things. Some of the personages that they refer to, like a redhorn, might be depicted here in the South. I wouldn't dispute that, but it's a bit like Christianity, where dispersed across Europe and other parts of the world, but yet there are local expressions of Christianity where it syncretized with the local traditions. There is the painted bluff little red guy outside, but you can see the rest of the things are charcoal drawings, except maybe stuff in Missouri where Carol and them have been working, and Wisconsin. So you can see it goes right through the latest stuff here, abstract in size. It's not a progression from a simple progression from abstract, simple to complex. I mean, some of the earlier stuff were complicated and iconographic too. So here I'm combining the ASM, AMS, the accelerated spectrometry dates with the relative dates. And you can see that, the petroglyphs still got some catch up to do. Maybe some of those earliest cupules and meanders, they simply weathered away. Or maybe the cave tradition where some serious medicine people went is an older tradition than the petroglyph tradition. The one below ground, the other above ground. The one sort of more an additive thing, the other one more subtractive thing. Then at the very end, before the Cherokees were moved out of Georgia in 1838, the Cherokees had a syllabary developed by Sequoyah. And Sequoyah, I think he perfected his syllabary in 1821. And characters that he got out of books and just maybe some of the things he made up to the basic syllables in the Cherokee language. And by 1825, I think most Cherokees mastered it. They were probably at that time more literate than a lot of Euro-Americans on the frontier or wherever were at that stage. And a lot of this went into production of these sacred formulas that medicine people made on hide and sold to, or on parchment and then sold to customers. So it was big business. And the first Cherokee newspaper, though that branch of Cherokees who wanted to westernize, the Phoenix, the Cherokee Phoenix, was printed in syllabary. So in 1828, in Manitou Cave, about 1.5 kilometers within this dark zone cave, Cherokees in very tiny writing, perhaps not much larger than the ones you see here on your monitor, on your screen. They wrote in charcoal, and in some cases, they incised where they kind of smudged the edges, and then they incised the syllabary. And some of the syllabary really refer to very special, highly sacred spiritual stuff that the Cherokees don't want to share. And I think it's the same with the petroglyphs. There's stuff that they just didn't tell Mooney, and some things that Mooney chose not to divulge. Because when he got the stories, they had to scratch him. He had to go through a purification, going toward a ceremony. So these things aren't just fantasy. This is part of their life. But anyway, so one of the leaders of the Stickborn team, perhaps, some of them family even of Sequoyah, went in and wrote in Cherokee, I'm the leader of Stickborn team on the 30th day of this month, April 1828. The dates they wrote in Arabic script, and I think some of it was in Western script, European script. But then it also referred to we have got blood coming out of our nose and our mouth. And the ball game, which you can see a photo by James Mooney in 1890, right before he left them, they were playing this game at the Koala boundary where there's still the Cherokee reservation. This is a bloody game, and it's a game really, they believe, is depending on the success of the medicine person, or as Mooney calls them, the shaman. He's not only the coach, but he's got to commune with ancestral beings, and he's got to prepare, and he does all these formulas and stuff while they're playing, and they put curses on the opposing side. The ball game was known as the Little Brother War. And these guys went into the cave to talk to the old ones. There's one closer to the entrance syllabary that at first the Cherokees could not decipher, but then they realized it's a mirror image, and the syllabary was done for the spirits behind the rock so they can read the request. And I think it's the case with a lot of this rock art. It's not just, it's the place. It's not just for people. It does relate to people in this world too, but it relates to spirit beings too in the action. So, okay, the Cherokees in a lot of the places, they've been removed. They're not there anymore. And where we find this stuff is non-renewable things we're dealing with here. I'm going to show you 3 examples, one from Judicula Rock, another one from Track Rock, and then the third example will be from the stuff in the museum. Judicula Rock through the years was first in the 1920s, dating back to 1800s, in private, on a private farm property. They took care, they were proud of the rock. It was out in the sun, it thrived. Sometimes I highlighted it. That's not a practice, you know, we would recommend today. But then in the 1960s, Mr. Parker, he bequeathed the property to the Jackson County because they had, you know, more funds to look after than people were interested in it. So they built a cinder block house around it, and that was the wrong thing because people crowded inside, they used it as a bathroom, they did the graffiti in the wall. So they knocked the thing down in the 1970s, put this gazebo-like thing around it, but there was a water problem and people still climbed on the rock and biological growth started because of the shadow. Then in the 1990s, they took the gazebo down and they had this open air thing, but people still entered and did stuff. And they thought that, you know, they'll put in a nicer walkway and so on. So in 2007, you know, Scott Ashcraft, Laurie Hansen, and various people from the Forest Service, Linda Hall from the North Carolina Shipper Office, in consultation with the Cherokees and also the local Caney Creek community who live in the area, decided they're going to, you know, fund recording and excavations. And then in 2011, the boardwalk was installed, the Cherokee celebratory year, and they invited Cherokees over during the opening, and the Cherokee elder came here. And you can see he's got a stick in his hand. And apparently it helped him, you know, just as a walking stick, but also some Cherokees don't want to touch the rock. It's so special to them. And so, you know, he pointed at the rock with that stick. And some people use the river reeds still so it shows you that these things are important to them. And another problem here was that it silted up through the years. And by 2007, it was almost halfway silted up. So, you know, through controlled excavation and later earth moving activities by professional landscape architects, they opened it up, they found a creek here, but then somebody in 2017 came and did these sort of swastika-like stuff over here. And irrespective of the boardwalk, irrespective of the signage, then it took me 2 seasons to properly remove it. That's what it looked after the removal. And I recommend that, you know, they did install a motion detection camera. And then also they should put a fence underneath the boardwalk so that people don't come there. At Judicula Rock, also problem, people getting onto the Track Rock Gap, sorry, people getting onto the rock. And in 1960, the Forest Service got the rock from the property owner, and they put these grills over it, these metal grills. Didn't stop the graffiti from happening, and people couldn't take proper photographs. So in 2009, James Wetstead he's from the Forest Service. He's very sympathetic towards Native American concerns, and he got me to record the site and also make recommendations. So yeah, they had a bit of a different strategy where they put these wooden beams in, and with this interpretation. They also invite delegates from the creek, the Muskogee Creek, the Tribal Historical Preservation Office, and there were academics involved, Professor Vogelson, and then also people from the Georgia Department of Transport. Then a third way that these things, or second big strategy, you know, apart from instead of just shutting the site down, was Margaret Perriman. When she came from Alabama initially in the 1940s, had to save her coupons during wartime gas rationing to pay for trips to go to Georgia to look at these rocks. So she really liked these rocks a lot. And she kind of pioneered the study of these things. And she also, you know, she had a charismatic and a persuasive personality. So she persuaded the powers to be to remove these rocks, because at that time there was this fashion where treasure hunters thought that treasure, gold was buried below these rocks. So sometimes they blew the rocks up. So this rock was moved to Reinhardt College. It was first on the lawn, but luckily now it's inside the Hall of the Ancients there. But not all of the rocks were that fortunate. Yes, Squirrel Rock in White County, which is next to Hickory Nut Mountain Rock. They was kind of sister rock. This one, for some reason, they removed, perhaps also worried about its integrity. And then it was moved to the campus of Georgia, where it did okay until a big tree grew over it. And now it's outside the archaeology hall there, and it's suffering. So this is not a way to do it. They should daylight it. UGA should follow the example of Reinhardt College and have this moved inside, because biological growth like this releases the little rhizomes that go into the interstices and the gaps between the rocks, and releases weak acids that are called chelating agents and weaken the rock. So you can see how in the 1930s, how and what good condition is in right now. Apparently when the stuff recedes in the winter, they look a bit better, but something should be done about that. And then finally, another thing that gripes me is that a lot of these sites open to public are still don't have a remote motion detection or hidden motion detection cameras. So here's a case at Paint Bluff where the Tennessee Valley Authority did install a camera, and here they caught a white-tailed deer setting off the camera. So anyway, so thanks for sitting with me through this. That is the end of it, and I guess now it is time for questions.
Hi, well, thank you very much, Jannie. You were very you covered a lot of ground here. Let's put it that way. That was a pretty amazing tour of that whole area in the rock art. So early on, you mentioned something about there not being as much vegetation or forest earlier on, and people were asking, why is that? Was that due to management by the Indians, or was that just a different climate?
No, the Indians manage it. I mean, they favored, you know, open grassland, prairie. You find evidence, and yeah, you've got to talk to an ethnobotanist, you know, looking at charcoal, but there's evidence to suggest that there were far less woodland, you know, and early travelers that they came through, people like Barton and stuff, so on, they in Adair, they talk about, you know, far more open land. And then as the Indians got disrupted and stuff, a lot of the land got abandoned. So they call it old fields, where, you know, these briars and things started coming in, and then pine, all the succession species. I know for a fact, and you can maybe, you know, blame, you know, later farming, you know, European farming practices, cotton farming and tobacco farming. But certainly until the 50s, if you look at aerial photographs and photographs of the terrain, and you saw some of the old photographs of Margaret Perryman and of the rocks, there's far less vegetation cover. And the rocks, they like sunlight. They like to be baked. A geologist said, once told me, it's like bread, you know. And the things that face south, the rock faces, and get a lot of sun during the day, during the year. I think that's one reason maybe why you get all the pictographs, you know, being so well preserved. And I think there's a thing of choice in there too. But certainly even since I've been here, end of 1993, trees have grown over these things. There is the Wells Fargo Bank in Marietta, just here north of Atlanta, and a massive oak has grown. The trees grow very fast in Georgia. I remember doing with Tommy Hudson some recording there in the late 90s, and that tree was still smaller and the rock was in a better condition. Now, you know, when you go and look at it, it's just not good. I mean, with all the growth there. So it's really up to people like me who should take more time to go and lobby with these people and put pressure on them to do something to sunlight these daylight, as they say, these rocks.
Now you said the Cherokee were farmers, uh,
Yes.
but they lived in the mountains. So did they farm on the slopes?
The mountains had some floodplain. Sorry, I wasn't very clear about that. As you could see, some of the topographic maps, they had. I don't know whether my thing. Okay, my thing is still working here. Let's see a map where this floodplain on the Louvre Floodplain, where there's a lot of. Just take for here, for instance. Okay, there's a ridge there, and there's a ridge there. That's where they would go hunting. But there, Peachtree Creek Mountain, it's there, located there, because there's rich alluvial soil brought down by this river. And when it floods, like the Nile, it deposits all the soil on the banks, and there's also colluvium and stuff coming down from higher slopes. So very deep, rich soils, very fertile, that they can plant. So that is where they had the big villages, also because they wanted to go to water, but that's where a lot of cultivation of starchy and oily things started even before corn was introduced.
Yeah, but you mentioned, okay, so you just said go to water. You mentioned the go to water ritual. What exactly was that?
It is a ritual where you kind of, just call it a purification ritual is perhaps not the right thing. In a sense it is, but it prepares yourself for a situation. So before you go to play a ball game against your opposing town, you represent your town. You and all your teammates, you fast a bit, traditionally at least they did. And then traditionally too, they might have scraped themselves with a sharp object, could be thorns, it could be a blade of chert, it could even be a sterilized rattle teeth snakes, it could be the teeth of a garfish. You scraped yourself with that and the blood will come off. And then you go into the water, you wash all that stuff. You also sit in the townhouse, I think, in the old days, or you go in the square ground. And then you go to water, you wash it off and you put new clay and stuff on. So you kind of like almost, I don't want to push the analogy too far, but you kind of reborn, refreshed. And then, before you want to commune with the spirit beings too, you went to go to water. So any sort of shift, from the everyday to something else, you went to water. And it had to be flowing water, ideally water that faces east, which is where the sun rises, which is the color red, which is life-giving power. And so basically, I hope I've explained it. Cherokee, of course, will probably be correcting me, but be giving you further insight too about the ritual.
Yeah. Okay. The question about how far some of these traditions might have gone. Somebody mentioned some similar lizard-like and circle with cross in it figures up in New Jersey. Is it possible that there was any connection between New Jersey and Georgia?
I don't know about that. It's not impossible, but similar symbols don't always mean contact, because you get things, the concentric circles, you get that out among the Paiute in Nevada, and I don't know whether they ever had contact with the Cherokee in pre-contact times. So certain things are worldwide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. There are some people that want to get in touch with you, and I will forward that information to you.
Thank you.
But yeah, we got some thanks online. I think a lot of people were fascinated, but it's getting late, so I think we're going to have to call it there. Um, so again, thank you very much for an amazing tour of rock art down in an area we don't usually hear that much from. Um, so again, thanks to all attendees, especially those of you who stuck it out till the end here. I'm sure a lot of people will be going back and catching it on the YouTube channel. Again, if you'd like to learn more about ARARA and our virtual conference coming up in June, please check out our website and our Facebook pages. And I remind you that our next speaker on May 8th will be Robert David. So good night and stay safe.